Hello, and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today, we're going to be discussing Russia and Ukraine. Specifically, my belief that Russia is not capable of conquering Ukraine. I'm not saying that there's no possibility of military engagement. I'm not saying that Ukraine would come anywhere near to winning any such military engagement, but I am saying that Russia is too weak a state to seriously conquer the majority of Ukraine. And we'll go into that in some detail. First, some preliminaries. If you're new here, the way this goes is I spend a half hour, 45 minutes, sometimes as long as an hour, babbling on a central topic. During that period of time, I can't really pay attention to what's going on in the comments. I'm not going to be paying any attention to that. But of course, enjoy the comments, enjoy interacting with each other, enjoy interacting with what I'm saying or whatever you want to talk about. We have very few rules for the comments. You can, for the live chat, you can say whatever you want about me. You can say whatever you want about my ideas. You can say whatever you want about Ukraine and Russia, as long as it's not too, genocidal. But what you can't do is attack each other. You have to be civil to each other in the live chat. To make sure that that's the case, we have Logo Cool Extreme, who is our moderator. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. If he decides that you are acting out and are a detriment to the conversation, he will warn you. And then if you don't cut out your behavior, he will block you. He will boot you from the chat. And yeah, it's Loga's decision. It's not mine. So yeah, listen to Loga if he tells you to cut it out. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A period where we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. That's the right time to ask questions. If you ask questions before we get to the Q&A period, I'm not going to see them. If you're going to do super chats, yes, obviously those questions for sure get answered in the Q&A period. I hope that you'll participate. So let's talk Russia and Ukraine. It's really frustrating to me the way that people talk about Russia's buildup of military forces on the border with Ukraine right now, and the way that people talk about Russia generally, because I'm not denying that, Russia is threatening Ukraine. That is something Russia is definitely doing right now. But the way that we talk about this, the way that we talk about the possibilities here, actually make me believe that it makes armed conflict more likely rather than less likely. I think the real concern that I have after researching this for a couple of days is, are we gonna make what happened in Georgia in 2008 happen again? Are we gonna make the Ukrainian government think, because of the heat and nastiness of US and European rhetoric, think that they have more backup from the United States and Europe than they actually do? Because we've certainly done a masterclass over the past 4 years in making it seem like the United States really hates Russia and is really eager for an opportunity to embarrass Russia. And I fear that we've gotten to the point where Ukraine could get to the point where they risk it. They're like, okay, fine, like let's go crush these the U.S. They've given us arms. They've got all this rhetoric. It seems like all CNN and MSNBC talk about is how much they hate Russia, Russia, Russia. Cool. Let's give the U.S. an opportunity to slam Russia. Let's go take back those. Let's go take back those breakaway republics. And if Russia retaliates, then NATO's going to come save our ass. And I think there's this real disconnect between what, and I don't think that would work out well for Ukraine, because there's this real disconnect between what the US public actually wants and what the warmongers in US media want. So I'm sure that, Rachel Maddow and, Jake Tapper would be delighted if the U.S. went to war against Russia for a couple forlorn scraps of Ukraine. The U.S. public and the U.S. politicians that represent that public, however eager they are to talk shit about Russia to get donations from the defense industry, are not eager to get into a big, nasty shooting war in Europe. And I fear that we might be fooling Ukraine and giving them the indications that this might be a good thing to do when it is absolutely not, and something that would blow up in everybody's faces. And the pointlessness of an actual shooting war with Russia over Ukraine is underlined for me, not just as an American who's is like, why the fuck am I bothered in this, but bothering being engaged in this, but also as, you know, like an Estonian or a Polish person or a Hungarian or a Ukrainian who's terrified of Russian influence. The Like, Russia is not a country that's on the upswing. It is not a country that's going to get more dangerous in the ensuing decades. Like, it is a country that is on a incredible plummet in power and influence, and it is this sort of conscious manipulation of the way that the U.S. public sees things that is the owned by the sort of U.S. military industrial complex is the only reason that we're talking about Russia as if it is a threat anymore. And then through a weird alchemy, by talking about Russia as if it is a threat, we compel this very weak country to lash out, to sort of desperately maintain what regional influence it has. And because the U.S. military-industrial complex gets out ahead of what the U.S. public actually wants, we end up creating situations where Russia actually does kind of look powerful. Like, Russia looks powerful in Syria because the U.S. military-industrial complex and its media wing talked up, you know, the importance of Syria, the importance of Syria, the importance of Syria, but nobody in the United States ever really gave a shit about Syria. So Putin won in Syria because, you know, Putin had an actual ally there to support and put in resources to support him. The U.S. public did not care to destroy Syria and give it to a bunch of jihadists, the way that most of the U.S. military and industrial complex did. So Russia looks strong and powerful because they were given a winning hand by the U.S. military industrial complex. Again, in Ukraine, the U.S. organizes a coup in 2014 against the democratically elected president. It was fascinating. To prep for this, I read a congressional research service report, and it was just fascinating. You know, they've got a special name for the revolution of dignity, or this, that, or the other thing they call it, and they just sort of never mentioned that Yanukovych was like democratically elected, and we helped overthrow him. And yes, Russia acted out in ways that were unpleasant. Annexing Crimea as it had promised. You know, we got the Ukrainians to give up nuclear weapons that they had in the late 80s, early 90s by guaranteeing its inviolability. You know, both the U.S. and Russia guaranteed that its territory would be sacrosanct, and Russia tore that up, it's a real bad trend in geopolitics over the past 30 years. Of screwing people for giving up weapons of mass destruction, and really illustrating, really underlining that holding on to weapons of mass destruction is a good idea. That's a really dumb and counterproductive thing that countries like the United States and Russia have done in service to much less important goals than keeping all of human civilization from dying in a nuclear holocaust. But you know, it's just something that happens, and both sides do. And anyway, I feel like there was another point I was making there that I fell off of. But yeah, with Ukraine, it's another example of the United States military-industrial complex and intelligence communities sort of getting out ahead of themselves, being like, "Oh, look, haha, we did a coup, and now our guys are in charge of Ukraine. Haha, fuck you, Putin." And Putin's like, "Oh yeah, fuck me, fuck you." Because I actually have military resources I'm going to put in there to take Crimea and, you know, whatever, quasi, semi-war Putin is contributing to in, was it Luhansk and Donetsk? And yeah, because again, like we're never in the US public is never going to care as much about regions like, oh, I don't know, Taiwan, Iraq for Iran, Ukraine for Russia, as much as the countries that are right there. And it's a really unpleasant thing that we've got this class of professionals in the United States who are supposedly the experts on all of these things that keep overcommitting the United States to these regions in ways that inevitably lead to suffering on the part of our allies and our enemies. And it's just it's depressing all around. But let's talk. I mean, let's talk a little more seriously about this grave Russian threat that we are grooming our Ukrainian allies to sacrifice themselves against. Russia was one of the superpowers. Even during that period of time, there's a whole genre of commentary looking at the Soviet Union. Not enough, honestly, and just people realizing just how wrong we got everything. The whole, from Kennedy talking about a missile gap when it's not entirely clear that the Russians had very many missiles at all. Just this endless list of fantasies that the U.S. Sort of Kremlin industry, military-industrial complex believed about the Soviet Union. Mutually assured destruction by the 70s or 80s was absolutely true, but it was something that the Soviet Union essentially had to bankrupt itself to bring about. It was always not quite as powerful as advertised. This is something that needs to be said more often, but is not focused on in most speaking about these issues. As extraordinary, well, actually, I guess almost in the other direction, reading a Politico article on the Czech bombing controversy. And according to Politico, the Czech Republic was part of the Soviet Union. So that's almost going in the other direction, which it was not. The Czech Republic as Czechoslovakia. Slovakia and Czech Republic were once a single country called Czechoslovakia. They were communist countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. They were not part of the Soviet Union. But the Soviet Union was largely made out of the Russian Empire, territories that had been taken by the Russians over the course of centuries. So while I do support Ukrainian independence, it's worth pointing out that Ukraine was Russian for I think all of Ukraine was Russian for much longer than California has been American. About 150, about 100 solid. Depends on which slice of Ukraine you're talking. But there's a lot of parts out west that belong to different empires. But yeah, significant chunks of Ukraine, certainly the chunks that are at issue in any conflict between Russia and Ukraine today, were part of the Russian Empire. And this isn't just the case with Ukraine, it's Belarus, the Baltic states, and I think it's good that all of these places have, all of Central Asia. I think it's good that these places have their independence, but I think we need to think about that a little bit more when we're assessing the Russian threat to the United States or the world or to Europe or to Central Asia or to really anybody other than those poor few countries that are still on Russia's border. It is insane to me if you just look at a map of where the Soviet Union was, and yes, where the Warsaw Pact was, and where the border of that was, going about halfway through Germany, compared to today, and we're supposed to be terrified of Russia. It's absurd. And just to emphasize, I mean, Russia is not a top 10 economy. It is I think it's number 11 by GDP. And yeah, there's GDP is obviously a calculation that doesn't necessarily reflect, true reality, but it's one of the best measures we have. And according to GDP, Canada is a bigger economy than Russia right now. I was reading that CRS report on Russia, and there's another fascinating aspect of it was just they would sort of talk about how Russia's trade relations, and Russia's number one trading partner is the European Union. But for the EU as a whole, Russia is their fifth trading partner, coming in after Switzerland. You know, like Switzerland is more economically important to Europe than Russia is, which is kind of a crazy thing to wrap your head around. Of course, there's the important caveat of oil and gas exports. We'll get to that in a minute, but it's becoming a less important caveat. China is their number one single country trade partner. Russia's number one single country trade partner. Number two, if you count the EU as a trade partner. So China is Russia's number one trade partner, and Russia is China's number 9 trade partner. Like Russia is not a superpower. Russia is not really even a great power. Russia looks like a great power if the United States consciously chooses to create situations on Russia's border or with, like in Syria, with allies of Russia of decades standing. That's the only way that Russia looks like a great power, is if the United States, as it did with the coup in Ukraine in 2014, as it did with the Get Assad project launched in 2011 in Syria, by making Russia look more powerful because the United States chooses to pick fights on its vastly shrunken borders. Russia is not a powerful country whose desperate rise we should be concerned about. As I've talked about before, what we should be most concerned with Russia is Russia's disintegration, is more state chaos in Russia. Russia has a nuclear program. Russia has a nuclear weapons program. That's a key distinction that should be made more often, and I get angry when people fuck that up. Like Iran has not had a nuclear weapons program since 2003. It has a nuclear program that it is allowed to have, and any country in the world is allowed to have. Russia has the second biggest nuclear weapons program on the planet, and the prospect of instability within Russia overseeing this vast infrastructure of nuclear weapons and nuclear waste and decommissioned nuclear weapons, stuff that could get lost, fall off the truck, is a vastly more existential concern for the world and every country in the world than like what happens in Syria or Ukraine. And that's something that I think it makes sense to start getting really concerned about. Vladimir Putin is a unpleasant character who has power in Russia, but he does have power over Russia, and there does appear to be sort of, a centralized, unified approach. He's sort of figured out how to keep Chechnya from spinning out of control. He's sort of, there's something there. I'm much more concerned about a Russia that falls apart after Putin than I am about one that gets more aggressive or becomes Switzerland or what have you. Because of all this, we're already looking at a Russia that looks powerful exclusively because of the dumb foreign policy choices of the United States, but also a place that's about to start declining much more rapidly. There are all kinds of disputes about. Actually, I think it's more trolls in my comments than it is anybody who really honestly disputes it at this point. But the world is going through a transition. 5 years ago, I was with the trolls. I was like, oh, come on. I was spitting the maybe more 7 or 8 years ago at this point. I was spitting the oil industry line. Oh, sure, renewables. Those are like a fun little hobby for hippies. It's never going to work. Well, now those folks are reduced to like, well, renewables have environmental costs too. We're to the special pleading point. The renewable shift is happening, and it is happening dramatically quickly. Whether we're talking about electric cars, the rollout of solar, wind, storage, what have you. I think that if you want a weaker, that's my interpretation, which is the strong interpretation of what's happening. That by 2030, We're going to have, coal's going to be gone. Natural gas is still going to be a factor in a lot of places, but it's going to be on its way out, and it's going to be a lot cheaper than it even is today, which is very key for Russia, a country that is entirely reliant, not entirely reliant. It's not like some Saudi Arabia or something, but it is very much reliant on oil and gas prices. So even if you're a skeptic of the renewable revolution and you think this is just a luxury item for rich countries, well, Russia's main clients for all of its oil and gas are a bunch of those hippie rich countries in Europe. You've got all of Western Europe that is, France is mostly nuclear already. Incredibly, the UK has gone from, I think, 40% coal powered a decade ago to 2% today. And yes, the gas share of that has gone up a little bit, but a lot of that has been solar and wind, which, yes, is still limited to 10 to 20% of the energy mixes in a lot of these countries. But if storage gets the treatment that Germany gave solar 20 years ago, which it seems like it's about to do in the United States, with people willing to overpay for energy storage until it gets more vastly rolled out and gets cheaper and cheaper. Yeah, it's just like Russia's main oil and gas market is about to disappear. They are building pipelines to China, and China is going to be using natural gas for a little bit longer, like into the 2030s, towards the end of the 2030s. But a Russia that gets more and more reliant on China for everything is not a happy or a safe Russia. And I think the folks in Moscow are pretty goddamn paranoid. That's something you can rely upon. And you can be goddamn sure that there are planners within Moscow's, military industrial complex that are getting really kind of nervous about how reliant they are becoming on China. As useful as a sort of Russia-China axis seems to be for diplomatic purposes, and it's fun to sort of join together to complain about the U.S. hegemon. Russia is not in an alliance with China. It is in a application to be a stan. It is a satellite relationship that Russia will be allowed to develop with China. It'll be like, you've got Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Russiastan, which will just be, the satellites of China. That's just sort of how that's working. So if you've got, a Russia that's already looking quite weak and has the prospects within the next 10 years of its entire, not entire, but it'll still have nuclear weapons, which is terrifying. But one of the main roots of its economy and its great power status, its medium power status, is the oil and gas economy that is dying out. Now, a very key point here that I always run into: I am not saying that 10 to 15 years from now, Russia will not be pumping oil and gas and selling it to people. It absolutely will, 100%. 15 years, no, in 2040. Russia will still, and probably in 2080, Russia will still be selling oil and gas. However, Russia will be selling less of it, and the price at which it sells that oil and gas will be dramatically lower than it is today. Even after today, we're now 7 years into an oil and gas price crash. Actually, my understanding is that with a couple spikes here and there, natural gas prices haven't even really recovered from 2008, and oil prices haven't recovered from 2014. So even at this sort of low point, which is sort of desperately maintained by Trump's foreign policy, knocking oil and gas producers off the market, Venezuela, Libya, Iran, and Saudi Arabia's drastic cuts to its production, with OPEC Plus and Russia's as well. I mean, this is like an oil and gas price that's sort of like, like barely holding itself up, head above water. And if Iran starts producing again, if Saudi Arabia says, fuck it, I'm sick of limiting my production to save everybody else money, if oil, if electric cars go from 3% of the cars on the road in the United States, it's probably not that high yet, 1%. If they go from 1% just to 10% over the next 10 years, then boom, like oil, it's just not a factor anymore. If storage becomes just, 50% more efficient, able to store oil, electricity stored by, produced by oil and wind, by wind and solar. If that goes from storage, I think currently can basically hold on to that power for 3 hours. If it goes from 3 hours to 4 hours, there are all these factors that are going to mean that Russia gets dramatically less reward from its status as a petrostate. Again, we're going to need oil and gas for certain purposes for the remainder of this century, almost certainly. But it's going to become a niche thing. And yeah, Saudi Arabia and Russia and some parts of Texas are going to be the last places pumping this stuff. But it's going to be like just another component. It's not going to be this incredibly geostrategically important thing anymore, which means Russia is going to be a lot poorer and a lot less important 10 years from now, which makes it insane that U.S., Europe, and Ukraine seem to be pushing for some kind of confrontation right now. And I'm not saying it's just Russia. It's not just the U.S., the European Union, and Ukraine that are pushing for confrontation right now. One of the really sad things about Russia's incredible drop in power and prestige is that we're sort of seeing what I like to call the North Korea-ification of Russia. And I think this is possibly on Ukraine's part and Russia's part, which is just sort of like, oh, there's a new U.S. president in town. It's time to see what kind of new deal we can get, what kind of new, how we can agitate to improve our position geopolitically. And I think that with every country in the world, as I do believe we sort of live in a kind of U.S. world system or U.S. empire, every country in the world does some variety of that calculation. What I talk about when I talk about North Korea-ification is that certain countries are so weak and so have so few other cards to pull that they're reduced to a kind of North Korea type situation. Where every new U.S. president, North Korea goes, oh, I'm going to throw a missile over Japan, or I'm going to blow up another bomb. It's bigger than the last bomb, so I can scare you and pay attention to me. My problems are important. Yeah, that's the North Korea-ification, and I think that's what we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine at this point. This is still really important. This is going to be a big deal. You should all pay attention to it. And I think, yeah, in ways that are really potentially very problematic, and we should all probably ignore. I don't mean that the public should ignore this. I think that U.S. policymakers should be less eager to co-sign the idea that we've got some kind of massive crisis brewing in Ukraine. One last thing that I want to talk about, and I think the weakness of stuff that looks strong and scary on the nightly news is something that I really want to point out. I don't want to jump into the minutia I generally don't trust the U.S. government intelligence community when it tells me things, but I think I might trust the Czech government. The Czech government with. I'm sure there were other inducements from the EU, from the US, what have you, but the Czech government yesterday, or over the weekend, indicated that it believed that Russia, in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, it believes that the Russian military intelligence plotted to blow up a series of munitions. Or is it just one? But anyway, there was munitions were stored in the Czech Republic, or Czechia, do we call it now? And the Czech intelligence services and Czech government has come out and proclaimed that in 2014, Russian agents blew up at least one of those factories. And that's real fucked up. And like poisoning dissidents, like barrel bombs, like these are horrific, disgusting, vile, cowardly things to do. And they are signs of weakness, not some, great, great and terrible nemesis that we have to confront. It's a sign of disarray, and like Jesus Christ, are you okay over there, guys? Like, you really think poisoning people and bombing countries that have going around sending folks to do terrorist bombings, like, that's evil shit. It's dumb shit, and it's an indication that Russia is in even more trouble than the numbers indicate. It's like it's scary to me, not because it speaks of Russian power. It speaks of extraordinary Russian weakness, and the possibility that Russia is in real danger. And this is an interesting thing. Like, yeah, I 100% think it's plausible that, yeah, okay, like the GRU, the sort of, I think GRU, that's Russian military intelligence, are doing these things, are actually assassinating people and whatnot. What I don't know is, like, is Putin aware of these sorts of things? Like, does Putin even know what's going on in his own security infrastructure, or when things like this happen, does he feel like sort of obligated to, like, cover for them, or of course the official things, oh, these things never happened, and ha 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 ha, we were denying it, but like beyond, like, the Putin's denying that these things happen to cover it up, for skullduggery purposes, is I mean, like, these are stupid fucking things that make Russia look stupid and weak and sad and gross. Like, if I were Putin or anybody who cared about Russia's dignity or self-respect in the world, I would not want them to happen. Yeah. So when I see something like that, I kind of wonder, is this an indication of the country spinning out of control? Sort of darker things going on in Russia than we know about, like things that Putin can't control anymore. And I think I think when you see something like that, your instinct should not be like, ooh, let's get more tensions with Russia. Let's give Ukraine some more arms and tell them, hey, aim them at them. No, let's be like, holy shit, like, what can we do to save Russia from plummeting? Like how do we get Russia back into the community of nations without it completely, self-destructing and taking the world with it? So yeah. So I think I could absolutely see. Now, all of this said, this does not mean that Russia is without military capability and without the ability to absolutely crush Ukraine's armed forces. I 100% believe that in a straight up and down fight, obviously, Russia would beat Ukraine on Ukraine's own territory. However, that's, as we know very well, that is, beating the actual military forces of a country you are invading is, barely step one. As Russia learned in Afghanistan, as the United States learned in Afghanistan, as the United States learned in Iraq. Sure, you can beat the military, and then the insurgency starts. Ukraine, my understanding is that it's already got a pretty advanced network of pretty fucking grim militias that are eager to have a chance at have a shot at a Russian occupying force. I think that yes, Russia could very easily crush whatever. I mean, maybe not so easily, honestly, with the amount of bulking up that Ukraine has done. And who knows, There may actually be some clever strategic thinkers with the Ukrainian military who would be good at preserving assets and prolonging the pain for Russian invaders. But I think that it seems likely under any rational analysis that the Russian military would defeat the Ukrainian military in an up and down fight. But how far could they get? I think is a real question here. I think that if there were an actual fight between Ukraine and Russia, I think my prediction is that Russia would sort of would basically take the rest of the coastline of the Sea of Azov, would rush to take Mariupol, and I'm sure I've mispronounced that, I apologize, and create a land bridge between Crimea and Russia. That, I think, would be the highest extent of Russia's goals, because it knows that it would expose itself more and more, and this is a Russian military that is overcommitted in many places, committed all over the world at this point. It's an overstatement. It's committed in Syria, it's committed in Libya, it's got, the Russian border itself is all over the world, and Russia has responsibilities there. So I think a realistic goal for a Russian incursion in Ukraine is to simply take that land bridge to Crimea, and even holding that, Mariupol is a real city, would prove to be an extraordinary challenge, and would also result in a speeding up of the renewable revolution in Europe, in that there would be real ramifications in terms of oil and gas. We talk a lot about sanctions that have been inaugurated against Russia, and they're very irritating to sort of Russian elites who've wanted to, party it up in Europe and do this, that, and the other thing. But oil and gas has never really been. Actually, yeah, I think there's some very good lessons for Russia here. Is you should take a quick look at what happened to Iran. Take a quick look at what happened to Venezuela in this new energy environment. It's funny because you'll find a lot of Trump supporters who are like, renewables are bullshit. None of this matters. That's been, the Trump administration's actions sort of showed how much renewables mattered. And yes, of course, shale revolution is a part of that, but it's not just the shale revolution, it's both. And it still holds true now that the shale revolution is mostly over, because Wall Street is no longer interested in funding that sort of thing because they didn't make any fucking money. So I think Russia needs to realize that 2021 is not, it's not 2008. It's not even 2014. The thing about sanctions against Russia that were put in place in 2014, and even throughout, the democratic rage fest at Russia over the past 4 years by the United States, haven't really impacted Russia's ability to sell oil and gas. Well, in 2021, we are in a very different world, not just because of renewables, but also because there are now terminals, sort of much better outfitted terminals to take in UAE and US gas in Europe. And there is a growing renewables percentage throughout Europe as well. So Venezuela is a country that quite ludicrously under Chavez positioned itself as a angry anti-US imperialism country, while also being completely reliant on the United States oil and gas markets. Like Citgo, I think Citgo is a US gas station operator and seller of petroleum gas that is fully owned by the Venezuelan government. So like, while Chavez was like, damn you, United States, US folks at the pump were directly subsidizing Venezuela's economy. And this worked really well for Chavez, because when we lived in a world of oil and gas scarcity, he was able to just, like forever. And then all of a sudden, we get to Maduro, and we get to we've got the shale gas revolution. We've got oil and, we've got solar and wind growing exponentially in usage all over the world. And all of a sudden, the United States says, we're not buying any more Venezuelan gas. And Venezuela's like, I thought that was impossible. And the Trump administration was like, well, yes, now it's possible. So fuck you. There's a similar dynamic in 2015 with actually the early, sort of early parts of 2015, 2016, and with the Trump administration as well, is that the Obama and Trump administrations were able to go much, much further against Iran than they had in the past because oil and gas was no longer something that was essential everywhere. And I think we're now reaching a point where, and of course, even in taking Iran out of the oil and gas markets was a huge, huge step. Venezuela as well, big steps that you could take in 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Taking Russia out it's on a Saudi Arabia or a US level. But I do believe that in 2021 and 2022, we're getting to that point. One just sort of small, thing on this, I've talked about Nord Stream 2 and how pissed off I am that the United States believes it can tell Germany how to, what to do with its own fucking money at this point, and how stupid that is for the United States to be taking that straightforwardly imperial position. However, it looks like the Greens might win the next election in Germany and just bin Nord Stream 2 anyway. Not that they're like pro-US empire. They're just like, we don't fucking need it. And we want a renewable future. So even if that sort of thing is a possibility, then I think Russia needs to understand that, yeah, okay, maybe it can beat up the Ukrainian military and get this land bridge down to Crimea. But then Europe might really stop buying oil and gas from Russia this time. That's something they can do. Or they can just, stop taking half of it. Because if they just stop taking half of it, I mean, that's a cataclysmic event for Russia, economically speaking. So yeah. So like my main concern right now with the Russia buildup on the Ukrainian border, I see that mostly as Russia jockeying for position, doing a North Korea play, like, hey, we're still here, we're still powerful, this matters. Pay more attention to us, pay more attention to our concerns. That's how I see it. My concern is that Ukraine will see this and see the way that US media and government have been talking about Russia for the past 4 years and assume that they're going to have US and European backing to go in and crush those breakaway republics. To be clear, those breakaway republics belong with Ukraine. I believe that fully, and I think that the future we should be working towards diplomatically is those regions no longer being breakaway parts of Ukraine. But I think Ukraine's going to be like, oh, this is our chance. Look how angry the U.S. media and government are at Russia, and everyone's talking so much shit about Russia. And oh, look, now the Czech Republic is angry at Russia because of this thing that happened 7 years ago. It's our time. Let's go do it. And then Russia intervenes and the world goes, whatever. We're just going to stop sending. We're just going to stop buying oil and gas from Russia. So both the Ukraine and Russia could, at the cost of tens of thousands, 100,000 lives, do themselves extraordinary damage and find themselves both massive, massive losers. And really, geostrategically for the West, the U.S. and Europe, that's a pretty bad fucking result because, Russia, invading Ukraine and sort of, if not disintegrating, sort of falling even further into rogue state status as it gets incredibly poor, provides a lot of opportunities for China to sort of start carving off both influence and maybe even geography in Russia. So yeah, it just seems like a bad thing all around. We should not be encouraging Ukraine to take military action against those republics right now because I think very bad things could happen. As I think most of you are aware, this is what happened in 2008. The U.S. and Europe started talking about adding Georgia to NATO. And Russia said it very much did not want that. And is it Saakashvili, the guy in charge of Georgia at that point, decided that fuck it, let's push things a little bit, and attacked the breakaway parts of Georgia that Russia had been maintaining, and then Russia invaded Georgia and beat the shit out of it, like quite miserably. And the U.S. and Europe said, did nothing. Ukraine is strategically more important, much larger than Georgia, actually in Europe. Well, anyway, that's a different video. So it's a different set of circumstances, but I think I think because of those different circumstances, the folks in charge in Ukraine are assuming that they're going to avoid that horrific result that Georgia got in 2008. But I'm not entirely sure that's the case. I think that if Ukraine pushed it, I think they'd be surprised at how little support they got from the U.S. So yeah. Okay, so I think that is the presentation. It's been most of 50 minutes. We are ready for Q&A. It is question time. What do you guys want to talk about? Did what I say make any sense? Russia has no plan to conquer Ukraine, but it sure has plans to bludgeon it badly if it feels too emboldened by the U.S. and plays full moves in the East, says Mammoth Lafouine. I would agree with Mammoth Lafouine on that. I think Russia definitely has plans to punish Ukraine massively. However, I think it would be smart for Russia to think a little bit harder about how punishing Ukraine massively would also end up punishing Russia massively. We are no longer in this situation where oil and gas, must be preserved no matter what. Oil and gas resources have to be preserved no matter what. I think it's entirely possible that if Russia punishes Ukraine the way that it probably could, that the EU would punish Russia with serious cutbacks on the amount of Russian oil and gas they consume, which would very quickly create a situation in Russia that could spiral out of control in very bad ways. Were there any super chats that I missed? I guess not. Okay. Logo Cool Extreme asks, Mo Freedom Foundation, how is this different from Azerbaijan's ability to conquer Armenian territory? Ukraine is a much bigger, much more strategically important country than Armenia. Armenia is very unlucky in where it is. It's surrounded by countries that are unsympathetic to it on every side. I mean, Ukraine. Oh, this is embarrassing. I can't off the top of my head tell you who Ukraine borders with. I believe Poland, Moldova, Romania. Does it actually have a Romania? So definitely Poland. Anyway, I can't remember maps. That's not a skill that I have. But Ukraine is also a country that has international law pretty much 100% on its side at this point. Crimea is nobody other than Russia believes that Crimea belongs to anybody other than Ukraine. Armenia was in the position where it was maintaining territory in Azerbaijan that everybody in the world, except for a very large and vocal Armenian diaspora, agreed was part of Azerbaijan. So Armenia was in a much worse position, both in terms of its size, its power, its neighborhood, its location, and its standing under international law. Not that international law is ever the deciding factor. It can be, but it can be a factor, and it absolutely was a factor in Armenia's loss of that Azeri territory to Azerbaijan. Ali Razi asks, let's see, are there any, let's see. Moad says, will the USA ever let Russia crash with all the nukes it's got? my concern, and I've got it, I think on the page, I've got sort of a list of Russia videos. There's a video I made, God, seven years ago, just talking about like if the U.S. had any real concern about Russia's nuclear capability and the risks, we would never, ever, ever have done a coup in Ukraine. We would never, ever, ever have let situations get the situation get as bad as it is today. I don't think Muad, I don't think there's anyone in the United States in power who's thinking seriously about the risks here at all. I think the U.S. most planners in the United States are still in this like, oh, Cold War mindset. Russia's all powerful, da 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 da. Whereas what we should be worried about is, oh God, Russian disintegration and what's happening to the nuclear material. That up until 2014, the United States actually had a very developed program and relationship with Russia to help them with funding and expertise, help them manage their decommissioned nuclear stockpile. Really, really smart program that was launched in the Bush era that ended over the Ukraine crisis. I think it was probably coming to its end already in 2014, 2015, but it absolutely could have been renewed, should have been renewed, if you cared about the safety of humanity or anything like that, but was not because of the Ukraine crisis. So yeah, I'm not at all confident that the U.S. is paying any attention at all to the risks of Russian disintegration, as it absolutely should. Galaxy MW says, what do you think will happen to oil exporting countries by the end of this decade? I think that countries that that are capable of changing, of diversifying, of changing their systems to be less reliant on petrochemicals, won't be great, but they'll be okay. Like, well, I don't know, the United States is a little bit of a petrostate. I think that shift is already happening and happens fairly easily because of the way we're structured. Might not be so great for Texas and parts of Oklahoma, and rural Pennsylvania and some other places, the Dakotas, anyway. A whole bunch of places that aren't that economically important. Well, Texas is economically important. Anyway, so Russia, if it can avoid getting a massive oil and gas embargo slapped on it by the EU, will be able to transition. I think that Russia is a petrostate, but it does have serious cores of expertise and hardworking people that could absolutely transition beyond this. I'm real worried about a lot of other petrostates. Specifically, I say that Saudi Arabia is Saudi Arabia is fucked. Like, Saudi Arabia is going to be finished by 2030. I've said that repeatedly. I stick to it. I think that interesting because Saudi Arabia is like the last place where we'll be pumping oil and gas. Like, there will be people pumping oil and gas in Saudi Arabia in the 2090s. But as I pointed out, that oil and gas will be worth dramatically less than it is worth today. So the Saudi system is unsupportable. But by the end of the 2020s, I think we're going to have dramatically fewer oil and gas producing states. And I think for a little while, there will be, those states that can produce oil and gas cheaply will occasionally make a tidy profit when that system goes through its, cyclical changes of what have you. But like Venezuela's oil industry, I don't think it's ever going to come back. Even if, boom, they got a new government that everybody liked and then was acceptable and stable, next year. And put all the best minds in the world into resurrecting their state oil company. I don't know that it would really ever come back in a very big way because the oil and gas that is produced in Venezuela is expensive, just like physically. Like there's more processing that needs to go into that. So places like that in Venezuela, I think there's a lot of Brazilian oil and gas that's really complicated. and expensive to produce, like that sort of stuff's just going to stop happening. I think like the Canadian oil industry is like, I think already most of the tar sands is done, as it fucking should. I mean, that stuff, whether you believe in climate change or not, that method of oil and gas extraction is horrific for the planet and the environment everywhere, just in terms of like the nasty byproducts that it puts in the atmosphere, leaving aside carbon. Yeah, so yeah, it's going to be bad. I think by the end of this decade, we're going to have dramatically fewer oil and gas exporting countries, and those countries are going to be very different in the way that their systems are organized, or they're going to be different countries. Okay. Ali Razi says, can we talk about Iran? There's been quite a few events this week. The talks with Saudi Arabia and the P5+1 and the sabotage in the Natanz are all significant. Yes, they are all significant. It's interesting because I think we see, I don't want to overstate the Saudi Arabian diplomatic overtures with Iran because we've seen those before. There's that fucking amazing photograph from 2 or 3 years back, I think. Is it actually MBS sitting down with Muqtada al-Sadr in Iraq, the famous head of Shia militias? Now, that might have been because al-Sadr was having a falling out with Iran, actually. So don't quote me on that. But my understanding, for Saudi Arabia, the Abqaiq, wow, that's very close to a slur. Anyway, the name I can't pronounce, the oil refinery that was blown up in Saudi Arabia in 2019, I believe. I think was a real wake-up moment for Saudi Arabia, much like Ukraine risks, actually, where they were like, look, like fucking, Iran or Iranian allies blew up 5% of the, took 5% of the world's oil production offline. Like, and, we're such great friends with the United States. Come defend us and do something. And nobody fucking did anything. So I think Saudi Arabia knows that when the U.S. is getting peaceful with Iran, it wants to pile on. So I think it'd be very interesting. I think Saudi Arabia knows that it's in its interest to become more peaceful with Iran now that it no longer has a presidential administration that makes saying nasty shit and throwing poop at the wall while talking about Iran its like main way of life, the way the Trump administration did. Now that that's gone, I think Saudi Arabia recognizes that it has to make some kind of diplomatic accommodation with Iran. How far that goes, I think, depends on those P5+1 talks. How far the U.S. really goes towards peace with Iran. I'm seeing a lot of stuff that is more cautiously optimistic about Iranian and progress back towards the JCPOA, towards the nuclear deal. And ironically, some argue, and I think there's some truth to that, that the Israeli attack on the Natanz nuclear site in Iran actually might have helped things move forward a little, in that it made the United States a lot less willing to listen to this, sort of the standard assholes, standard defense industry assholes in Washington, D.C., who are so firmly against, peace with Iran. It's real hard to be like, you can't make peace with Iran, those fucking psychos who were doing terrorist activities against in their own territory. Yeah, it sort of, it kind of, I think that was probably kind of a dumb move by Israel there. Or rather, sorry, by Israel, by the aspects of the Israeli government who are fucking fully paid partisans of the U.S. military-industrial complex. Folks like Netanyahu, who basically work for U.S. defense contractors. There's very little in the past 15 years of Israeli politics that have done anything to support Israeli security and Israeli longevity, the longevity of the Israeli state. Let's see. John Johnson, question, where is the UN Security Council in this? Well, if we're talking about Russia, then nowhere. So, because Russia's on the UN Security Council and can veto any actions related to Ukraine. So that's sort of how that works. It's interesting. Christopher Lupoy asks, what are your thoughts about the Russian Federal Reserve being partially owned by American institutions? I think that people go, I think that finance is tremendously complex. And I think on these chats, we've spent, or maybe more in the patrons only chats, we've spent a lot of time talking and discussing about how, well, actually nobody really understands finance. And like, I think the problem with how few people understand finance is that a lot of people come up with explanations that make a lot of sense to them. And they're kind of hard to disprove because you realize nobody really understands what's going on with finance. And this idea that, like, did you know the Federal Reserve is actually privately owned and there's stock owners of the Federal Reserve that, and I'm just like, well, that's not exactly like, there's some truth to what you're saying, but it doesn't actually work the way you think you're saying it works. But I don't really understand how it works enough to conclusively tell you that that's why that works. And I think my sense is that the question of, foreign ownership of the Russian Federal Reserve, what are we talking about? Debt stocks here? I'm not sure what you're talking about. And I'm pretty sure if I looked into it, I wouldn't quite understand what you're talking about. But if I spent like 3 days looking into it, I'd be like, that's not quite as sinister as you're saying it is, but I can't tell you exactly why, because really, anyway. So yeah, I tend to avoid, I can't avoid it entirely. At least a couple times a year, I'll read a book on it and sort of try to wrap my head around stuff. But yeah, I think the idea that Russia's got a U.S.-owned Federal Reserve sounds a lot like some kind of Russian nationalist scare tactic that might not saying you're advocating anything like this, but it's going to circle back to conspiracies about the Zionists or something that just don't really appeal to me. Okay. Zagros Zemnako asks, if Russia does make a move and it gets punished for it, how will China view this? An opportunity to expand further influence on Russia in the Far East or other things? Exactly. I think that there's a lot of assumptions that people make about, something's going to automatically mean World War III because, the U.S. did something in Syria or did something with Iran, and then Russia and China are going to rush to the defense of these countries. And that's not how that works. Russia and China have sort of, not alliance, can't use that word, but a sort of a partnership of convenience when they both want to argue against U.S. imperialism. That's sort of their, they love, but it's not like we're yet to a point where Russia and China would back a play. If China and the U.S. got into a massive war in over the Taiwan Strait, well, Russia would stay the fuck out of it and keep selling oil and gas to anybody they could, and be delighted that, and then maybe in that context, take some chunks of Ukraine or something along those lines. Yeah, it's not, but it's not like they would back China against the United States. They would be delighted. The most ridiculous approach to this is the idea that like China or Russia would back Iran. Absolutely not. They might take advantage of the situation, but it's not like they're gonna rush to Iran's defense. And I don't think that China certainly wouldn't rush to Russia's defense, and absolutely would look for opportunistic ways to take advantage. Certainly solidifying probably an already present status as the indisputable hegemon of Central Asia. Um, Probably, it is kind of tricky. While I'm sure there are folks in China who would want, I think, was it the Amur River region of Russia was, I think, carved off even after Hong Kong. It was the 1840s or 50s or something like that, carved off by Russia from China. I'm sure they'd want that back, but China is just prickly enough to nuke Beijing over something like that. But would China look for ways to make Russia even weaker? Quite possibly. I don't know. It's a very complex question, but no, China would not like come rushing to save Russia from a EU NATO embargo. How would they even do that? I think seriously underestimating the ethnic hatred in Eastern Europe. If this war starts, it will start all of Eastern Europe on fire, from Balkans to the Baltics. I don't think so. Unfortunately, I think Hitler and Stalin might have done too good a job. Turning all those places into roughly homogenous places. Though obviously the Hungarians don't agree with that sort of thing, but I do think that the Hungarians would probably not pile in on Russia's side. I think that would probably be a poor choice, because even all those nasty nationalist irredentist forces in Eastern Europe, most of them have experience of being oppressed by Russia. So I don't know. I do agree that there's a lot of in certain places, specifically Hungary, there are some unresolved claims by ethnic groups after the 20th century. But I just don't think they're gonna. I think actually like a serious conflict with Russia rolling back into Eastern Europe as a war with Ukraine would be. I feel like I just don't think that those things are gonna get sparked. Sorry. Question. Questions. Are there? What is the path for Russia to change gears and become a Western ally as opposed to an adversary? What is the path? That is kind of interesting. Well, there need to be less crisis points, and I think the U.S. can actually make it easier. I think the U.S. No longer trying to destroy one of Russia's only allies in Syria would be good. The Ukraine is going to remain a pain point. We haven't made any commitments that would be honored to Ukraine, but we have made commitments of prestige and sort of public view to Ukraine that are, I think, the U.S. isn't willing to give up. We have made no worthwhile or longstanding commitments in fucking Syria. The Kurds are happy to work with Assad, would be delighted to work with Assad against Erdogan, the Turkish foreign occupying army that is there to kill Kurds. It's bananas that the United States is still sticking itself into Syria. Perhaps we should hold on to that until it can be traded for something. I don't think it'll be traded for anything in Ukraine, but I don't know, is there a way we can be like, hey, we just pull out of Syria, how about you sell out those, the folks in Transnistria, or force them to get on to reactivate some of the peace processes that have been going on in Transnistria. That's the frozen conflict in Moldova, which is just another annoying little thing on the other side of Ukraine. So maybe some kind of trade between the United States, we'll finally pull out of Syria if you just agree to push the peace talks in Moldova back, onto a better plane. I don't know, something along those lines. I think one of the best things the United States can do to make so Russia can't be forced onto a better path, Russia, what needs to happen is things need to calm down enough for Russia to be cajoled onto a better path. And I think just there being fewer flashpoints for the United States to be focused on would help that happen. I think that if the United States would finally make peace with Iran and resolve conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and because that's really all the United States has to do is just be like, we're cool with Iran, whatever. And I think that Yemen, Iraq, Syria, are all places that would be able to stabilize. U.S. could commit those forces elsewhere, could commit that diplomatic capital elsewhere, could commit that financial capital elsewhere. And I think we need more pathways and opportunities for engagement with Russia. And if we, at the same time, reduce pain points and make it clear that the U.S. is less caught up in creating permanent wars everywhere, then the Ukrainian war becomes more of a standout and more of even more embarrassing than it already is. And the more embarrassment is an incredibly powerful force in geopolitics. If the Middle East, peace started breaking out across the Middle East, just the racist instinct of Europe being like, what, the Middle East can figure all this out? And yet we've still got this embarrassing ass frozen conflict or active shooting war in Europe. Well, God damn it. So yeah, utilize European racism. And that it might get Russia and Ukraine closer to the deal table. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, but I do think that after NATO had worked for 25 years to create this situation, finally created a rogue Russia in 2014. It is a difficult thing to unpick. I'm more focused on let's not have a shooting war. But I do believe that I made a video 6 years ago saying that Russia will join the EU within the next 30 years, and I think I've got about 23 years on that prediction. And I'm not sure there'll be an EU in 23 years, but there will be some kind of European alliance system. And I do believe in 23 years from now, Russia will be a part of it. But yeah, it's a difficult trajectory. Jack Hawkins asks, what does Germany do if Russia gets more aggressive and the U.S. continues to do not much? Well, Germany just stops buying Russian oil and gas. That's really all they have to do. And Russia becomes a dramatically weaker country. So yeah, the thing about European lack of interest in the Ukrainian issue, or lack of interest to arm up and get super paranoid about the Ukrainian issue, is the chances of a Russian tanks rolling as far as Odessa, let alone Kiev, or anywhere further, are so goddamn slim. So it's not. I mean, Germany will be very, very disappointed, and I think Merkel was, has already been jumping on the phone with Putin to complain about the massing of forces on the Ukrainian border. But Germany just couldn't be less threatened by this. And yeah, all they have to really do to really, really, really hurt Russia is stop buying so much oil and gas from it. And it's yeah. So I think that there's this sense that, and I think, the Poles feel threatened by this in very real ways, because the Poles were occupied by Russia for 300 fucking years with a 20-year interim, ending 30 years ago. So yeah, the Poles are taking this a lot more seriously, but I don't know that they really should. And I wonder, actually, honestly, if even the crap ass militaries that we mock so much that Germany and Poland have are already equal. They might already be equal to the task. Germany, Russia, Poland, Ukraine combined, I guess, against a Russian expeditionary force attempting to make its way further into Ukraine, I think even with the resources they have now, I'm sure folks will laugh at me for this. I wouldn't be surprised if Germany, Poland, Ukraine by themselves could stop a Russian military push towards Kiev. I think that's very possible. Yeah. Fadel asks, do you want the U.S. to distance itself from Israel like you want it to do from Saudi Arabia? Well, it never will. So it doesn't matter if I wanted to. I think there's a lot of, this is another thing where folks, I think if the U.S. gets back in the Iran nuclear deal, which I think it will, you will find people screaming bloody murder. The Israel lobby will scream bloody murder. Oh God, look, the Democrats or Biden or everyone's abandoning us. How dare you? And the IDF and Mossad will be like, oh, thank God, the Iran nuclear deal was like a good thing to do. So like there's the level of like political screaming that, drives political donations and perceptions on cable news in the United States versus like what's actually happening. And I think what's actually happening is the whole Iran thing. As I made a video on this, last Tuesday? Last Tuesday's video was like the whole Israeli obsession with Iran is just, I mean, it's a fraud. It's a joke. It's the reason that Israel is obsessed with the threat from Iran is because Israel was running out of threats in the 90s and had to build something up to justify its own military industrial complex. So while Netanyahu and a whole bunch of dumbasses at IPAC and Washington, D.C. are going to just scream and cry it's really in the final analysis going to mean absolutely nothing, no real changes to the U.S.-Israel relationship. Israel is essentially, the 51st state. The United States will, if there were ever a real threat against Israel, as there was in when was the Yom Kippur War? I'm sure there's many on this chat who know that by a different name, but I can't recall what it was. But the war in 1973, 1974, that was the last point at which I think Israel was seriously threatened. And the United States, backed them up, and that will be the case certainly as long as I am alive. I think that there is no question that there is a dumbass Israeli lobby that's really just sort of a subset of the Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin lobby that advocates for all kinds of dumb, violent bullshit that I think will be, humiliated a little bit in the coming years. But there's well beyond the Israel lobby, well beyond the evangelical crazies that want there to be an Israel so they can all convert to Christianity during the apocalypse. Well beyond those crazies, there's a real bedrock of support for Israel in the United States. Our culture, I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't seem anti-Semitic because it's not anti-Semitic, but our culture is Jewish in a lot of ways, and I say that in the best way, in the way that U.S. culture is Italian, U.S. culture is European, U.S. culture is Mexican, U.S. culture is made of all these disparate threads, but there's no denying that the sort of there are very strong Jewish elements in American culture that have been one of the stronger themes of the 20th century, and that may even be fading a little bit. The Jewish Americans are no longer a put upon minority. They've got they're now in the situation that Irish Americans were 50 years ago. It's no longer the put upon minority. Occupy plenty of spaces of wealth and power, and their kids just want to go fucking make documentaries and be in bands. But the 20th century, a lot of 20th century culture, American culture that I adore. What is it from? What's the Big Lebowski line? From something to Sandy Koufax. But superheroes. Most worthwhile 20th century U.S. literature. Like, I mean, it's just, and I'm like, yeah, it's not like it's not a sinister thing. It's just like the U.S. loves immigrants who do well, and Jewish Americans were probably the immigrants that did the best back in the 20th century, and that provides a real just sort of bedrock commitment of the United States to Israel that's just never going anywhere, and that's not a sinister thing. That's a like who the United States is thing. So yeah, folks who are hoping that yeah, Saudi Arabia will not be here in a decade. Israel will. I think is Israel going to be there forever? I mean, I don't know. Possible. Is the United States going to be there forever? I don't know. Possible. I mean, we could, but I think for Israel to be meaningfully dislodged, you'd need like a Syria, like you'd need like a World War II, World War III level conflict. And even at that point, I think Israel's already done a pretty good job of ingratiating itself with powers outside of the United States. So like even if you had like sort of a worldwide war of a level apocalyptic enough to sort of reorder world order, I think that the Israelis would probably be better positioned to take advantage of that next order than anybody else in the Arab world. So like, yeah, I just don't. I think Israel's probably there for the duration, and folks in the Arab world who are pissed off about that should I don't know. I think the Israelis actually. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think the Abraham Accords, as poorly implemented as they were, and as gross as the partners that they chose to work with were, I think there was a fundamental insight at the core of them, which is that if the Arabs want to avoid returning to Turkish or Persian domination, then Israel's their best bet. Allying, sort of I mean, I think, yeah, I don't know. I go too far down that route, and I'll piss off a lot of people. But I do think that's probably like the best future for the Arab world is sort of actually banding together with Israel against to balance out the Turks and the Iranians. Which, yeah, I know there's a lot of people who wouldn't like to hear that, but I think that's probably the direction we're heading. Okay, so no more super chats, huh? Questions. Well, Vado says, I don't think Israel as it exists right now will exist post 2070. I think it probably will. But yeah, I mean, as it exists right now, I don't know, like what's going to happen with the Palestinians, like what's going to happen. I think it's probably going to be a one-state solution with the Palestinians. Well, I don't know. I think it's possibly, but I think it's a distinct possibility it'll be a one-state solution where the Palestinians and the few remaining secular Israelis band together against the vast majority of the people in Israel and Palestine who are, hyper-Orthodox Israelis by 2070. That's a possibility. But yeah, I mean, obviously there's going to be changes. I mean, Israel can only exist so long as the apartheid state that it is. But yeah, I don't think. I think Israel has the capacity to get past the Palestinian question. I don't know exactly how that's going to happen, but I think it's possible. Question: Victory TRDS: Is Iran a real existential threat to Israel? Absolutely not. Iran has been desperate to do a deal with Israel and the United States for 30 years now. The Mossad and serious thinkers in the IDF don't think that Iran is an existential threat. They rightly don't like. Nobody should like the idea of Iran getting a nuclear bomb. Nuclear proliferation is bad. But even in that case, the folks who run Iran are rational. They're not going to poison their own region, especially because Israel has nukes of its own and many more. Yeah, I don't think Tehran is going to wipe itself out just to destroy the Dome of the Monarch. Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. There's not a lot of real sensible thinking about the threat that Iran poses to Israel because it doesn't pose one. Anyway, yeah, I mean, in Hezbollah, come on, like how many times has Hezbollah invaded Israel? Zero. How many times has Israel invaded Lebanon? At least twice. These are not serious discussions for serious people. But I guess when you're dealing with U.S. and Israeli propaganda, you're not dealing with serious questions for serious people either. Thoughts about Ethiopia? Well, I'm worried about Ethiopia because I have a lot of hope centered in Ethiopia, and I would really like Ethiopia to succeed. It is a huge country with tremendous resources that has had a good trajectory the past 20 years. But as I pointed out in the video, a couple months back, getting rich doesn't automatically make doesn't automatically make countries peaceful. And of course, Ethiopia is not by any stretch of the imagination rich. That's obvious. But it is not as poor as it once was, and there is enough wealth for them to fight over, which is pretty grim. I had hopes that perhaps in a rather Machiavellian approach that actually Abiy Ahmed is going after the Tigrayans, the old leaders of Ethiopia, would lead to calming ethnic tensions throughout the rest of Ethiopia. That appears to have not happened. So we've just got the violent ethnic tensions that we've had in Ethiopia for quite some time, and now we've also got a full-fledged civil war going up in Tigray that's apparently the worst war going in the world right now. So yeah, I'm worried about Ethiopia. I'd very much like Abiy Ahmed to succeed. I'd very much like large numbers of people to not be dying. I don't know. The Horn of Africa is just a place with so much potential and so many brilliant people to take advantage of it, but just still has problems. Myra 30 says, will Somalia go to third civil war due to the term extension by the incumbent president? Ethiopian and Eritrean armies involvement possible? God, one would hope that Ethiopia, because didn't Ethiopia have to withdraw a lot of its troops from Somalia because of the civil war in Tigray? I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm reading a lot about the Horn now, but I am not anywhere near close enough to. I couldn't even tell you the name of the incumbent president of Somalia at this point. There's a lot going on in the Horn of Africa and everywhere else as well. So, yeah. Question: how will the Turks and the Iranians dominate the Middle East? Well, it's already kind of happening. You've got the Iranians. You've got the Iranians with serious influence in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq. You've got the Turks with serious influence all the way through to Tunisia. It's something that's often used as a pejorative, but I mean, Erdogan's the guy who, he's sort of the standard bearer of Islamic democracy. Political Islam, and that has power. I mean, even as far as Morocco. You've got, I don't think you have too many Turkish troops on the ground, but you definitely have Turkish troops on the ground in Libya. You've got Turkey occupying significant swaths of Syria. You've got Turkey, thanks to, you've got Turkey with, I think, a large base in Qatar. It's already being divvied up between Iran and Turkey, and Iran has really hasn't even really started playing the game yet because it's been so encumbered by the United States. It's that's something that's already happening. Where is Loga? Are people not acting in a way? I mean, Logan could have just fallen asleep. It's quite late in Malaysia. But what is somebody acting in ways that I don't know? The live chat seems pretty benign. I'm not seeing any. EM says the Islamic Democracy Project failed. The Islamist parties have been on decline, and anti-Turkish policies are just starting. Iran has a larger chance. I mean, I don't know if that's quite fair to say that the Islamic Democracy Project failed. Where has it been tried? Tunisia exclusively, and Hada has, actually proven that you can have Muslim Brotherhood oriented parties that function in a multi-party democracy, despite the fact that elements within Tunisia are trying to stop that, end that experiment. Yeah, I don't necessarily. This comes down to, did the Arab Spring fail? Oh man, we won't know about that for 50 years. I mean, the classic example is sort of 1848. 20 years, 15 years after 1848 in Europe, it looked like every single revolution had failed. Yet by 1900, it was pretty clear that most of them had succeeded. That's my take on the Arab Spring. I think our dispute, EM, might be like, what do you mean by Islamic democracy? Do I mean specifically like Muslim Brotherhood affiliated parties, or do I mean like the idea that democracy is compatible with Islam? And I think that is absolutely something that has been fought for and died for in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Turkey, and other places, and I think is still a very, very open question that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are fighting mercilessly to make an impossibility. But I think it's still a very open question. Victory TRD says, question, will we see USD hyperinflation in our lifetime? Will we see USD hyperinflation in our lifetime? I don't know. Yeah, I think we spent maybe half hour, 45 minutes, half hour on this question in a patrons only chat recently. But yeah, I don't know. I do not understand finance. The more I study it, and I study it a fair amount, the more I realize that nobody fucking understands. According to sort of classic views of economics, we should have had hyperinflation at some point in 2009 or 10 because of the stimulus package. At some point in it was 2013 that the Fed started doing quantitative easing. We should have had hyperinflation there. We should have had hyperinflation at every point during the Trump administration with trillion-dollar deficits and no indication of ever wanting to stop them. We should have had hyperinflation. It's just the hyperinflation is something we're always supposed to have, and then just never happens. But I do believe that there is eventually a price to pay. We can absolutely borrow more than we thought we could, but we can't borrow an infinite amount. And I think there is eventually something to hit. So in our lifetime, yeah, I think it's possible. Or, we could just start, finance could regularize. I think that's a possibility folks don't think about too much. That actually, we could get unemployment pretty low, and the Fed could be like, actually, I think we're good, and we could taper, and the Fed could stop buying stuff, and yeah, I mean, things doesn't necessarily have to mean that the U.S. national debt goes on until everything goes up and up forever until everything falls apart. But that is a possibility. I can't say whether or not it's going to happen. Man, no super chats, huh? Let's see. Pro commentary says, I'm Arab and we don't want secularism in our countries. Do you like elections? I can notice North African countries are becoming more and more secular, to be honest. Yeah, I think that there's a ludicrous, there's a podcast I follow mostly because I used to hang out with one of the guys in it, called Wisdom of Crowds, which is fun because it's sort of like it's basically like Washington D.C. orthodoxy that thinks it isn't Washington D.C. orthodoxy, which is adorable. But it's fun. And there was one guy, Shadi Hamid, who's quite infuriating often. One of the last people defending the U.S. Libya intervention that is destroying the Sahel to this day. We saw it. Got the president of Chad killed yesterday. But you put out this ludicrous article, intentionally trolling. I didn't read it because I think you had to pay to read it, saying how Christianity had failed and how actually Islam is much, much more resistant to secularism and is a much stronger religion and da, 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 da. And I'm just like, Jesus Christ, like the Christianity has been struggling against the forces of secularism since what, Spinoza, like 350 years ago. Islam has been struggling against those forces for what? Well, at best 200 years. I would argue probably a little more like 70. Because while a lot of those countries were conquered by Europeans actually used an enforcement of historic religious belief as a way to maintain power. And we're traditionally not a big fan of secularists in those societies who tended to also be revolutionaries. The Christian European world has been, fighting against secularism for about 350 years, the Muslim world for about 50. And you can find plenty of examples of folks in Europe reacting with fundamentalism, religious extremism to secular forces. So, I think that, yes, it's interesting because I'm a big believer that Islam has been unfairly demonized and attacked, but I'm also a pretty big believer that Islam, as it is currently practiced, will shift dramatically in a more secular direction over the course of our lifetimes, and already is really. So anyway. Questions. DSM 0305. Do you think democracy in Afghanistan will survive after U.S. leaves? I don't really know. Yeah, I don't. I think that folks go a little too far in expecting history to repeat exactly, expecting sort of Saigon 1975 in Afghanistan, but I think that's probably the most likely result. I think that you can make a rather grim argument that perhaps the main thing holding back the Afghan government that we support is that they've sort of have been a little too respectful of human rights and haven't just been wiping out Taliban villages. And maybe they start doing more of that after we leave and they end up winning. I don't know. That's a possibility. I think people are a little too confident in assuming that it's going to look exactly like Saigon 1975, 2 years after the U.S. Pulled its troops out of Vietnam. Our South Vietnamese ally, fell apart, and you had, people on helicopters at the top of the U.S. embassy hanging on desperately trying to get away, and it looks very embarrassing and sort of seen as a national humiliation for the United States, which is, of course, the starting point of Vietnam finally recovering and becoming a place worth living. But what was I saying? But yeah, do I think that the Afghan government is the most likely survivor and winner of the United States leaving? No, I don't think so. I think it'll be a grim couple years for Afghanistan, followed by hopefully building a sort of somewhat unified government that can eventually evolve into something better, as has happened in Vietnam, I believe. You've mentioned that World War I was Great Britain's fault, which is pretty logical. But if the U.S. is focusing too much on Russia and China, then which country will be the new Germany? It would have to be sort of everybody. At this point, and for the next 40 or 50 years, it would have to literally be everybody banding together against the United States. And I think that's a distinct possibility. You know, we're not abusive enough yet to turn literally everybody in the world against us, but I can see that trajectory. I can see that, you know, it's getting worse and worse, the way the U.S. treats the world. So yeah, certainly in the 2020s or the 2030s to get a serious war that would defeat the United States, or that would suck up our resources enough. Yeah, it would have to be sort of everybody versus us, or sort of a few countries versus us, and everybody else just sort of being like, yeah, you're on your own, Jack. So yeah. Victor TRD, again, man, you keep asking these questions I can't answer. What is your prediction for Lebanon? Nothing good. Nothing good. I mean, Lebanon is fallen into such chaos, and it's very sad, because it looked like, you know, it held up fairly well for the first 7 or 8 years of the U.S. and its allies actively destroying its neighbor Syria. It held up heroically well. Unfortunately, now it appears that its financial system has collapsed in ways that it's hard to see the way out of. Haven't made as much of a. What do you think of the assassination of Chad's president? You know, the guy was in power for 30 years. He's probably not a guy to mourn that much. But I think the fact that Chad, like Mali, like northern Nigeria, like Niger, like a whole bunch of other countries, has been destabilized to the extent where heads of state are getting, you know, it's been an hour and a half since I've looked at the news. I don't know if it was, we're now calling it an assassination, but, you know, if he's been, you know, if we're to a point where heads of state are being assassinated or being killed on the front lines, I think the official story was, we've seriously, you know, we've got countries with serious problems. And, you know, all of this is fruit of the poisonous tree of the US's destruction of Libya in 2011. And it's, you know, it's, I've been called overly conspiratorial, but the United States has commands throughout the world, that sort of geographically oriented commands, and also I think there's Pacific Command, CENTCOM, which I think is most of the Middle East stuff, Central Command. I can't remember what the other. I think there's a Cyber Command and there's a Space Command or whatever. But in 2008, the U.S. government organized an Africa Command, an AFRICOM. And within 3 years, we destroyed Libya, and the destruction of Libya led to a stream of weapons and fighters expanding across the Sahel that quickly led to the falling to Mali, one of the countries that had been one of the stable success stories of Africa. Mali quickly falling into destruction. You know, northern Nigeria has a lot of its own problems. The Sahel has a lot of its own problems. But one of the main factors in the instability that is experienced over the past decade is the U.S. invasion and destruction of Libya. So it's so convenient, isn't it, that we established an AFRICOM in 2008. Within 3 or 4 years, it had a shit ton of work to do because of destruction that the U.S. military had brought about. And it's still, you know, you'll see these articles in The Economist, the New York Times, like, ooh, the real threat of the Islamic State is in the Sahel now. Oh, you know, that's where the terrorism is. It's in the Sahel. Well, it's because we put it there. So that's what I have. That's what I have to say about the assassination of Chad. Super chats aren't working. That makes me sad. Huh. Well, that fucking sucks. Well, I guess that's another revenue source I don't have anymore. So you should sign up on Patreon. Let's see. Just don't poke Germany too much and everything will be all right. Well, I don't know. I mean, it is interesting how, as recently as like Reagan and Thatcher, their main concern as folks who grew up through World War I and World War II was, oh God, we must not allow Germany to become powerful again, which makes it kind of extraordinary that, you know, Donald Trump's like, Germany should have more weapons and more arms. And it's just sort of a sign of sort of how much the world has changed. That I think it's not just Trump, it's Obama and Biden would also like Germany to rearm. You know, like it's fascinating and a real historic shift that it's a U.S. the German rearmament is a U.S. goal. That is not something that would have flown at any point in the 20th century. Angel Balanzar says, More Freedom Foundation, do you ever feel extreme rage at U.S. foreign policy, or are you always calm and collected as you behave? Do I really come off as calm and collected in my videos? Yes, of course I feel extreme rage at U.S. foreign policy. We're murdering people all over the world for fucking nothing. And it's not even that we're murdering people and it's like a neutral thing. We're murdering people and making the world more dangerous for ourselves. It's fucking insane. Of course, I'm overcome with rage, but I think I don't think that making videos that are overcome with rage is helpful or will improve things or get people to change their minds. And in fact, I try to craft my videos. I'm happy to hear that that always seems calm and collected because I consciously do that. I think I've got, I think I spend a lot of time, preaching to the choir, a lot of folks who agree with me, but, out of the 2,000 odd folks who watch my videos every week or I think it's solid 2,000 to 3,000 people watch every video. And sometimes it goes up to 10. I think there's at least a few people who might be persuaded and might be persuaded by someone speaking in a more calm and collected approach, with a more calm and collected approach than with a one filled with rage. So, yeah. But yes, I get very angry, and I think it's also pointless and sad. And we didn't need to do this. Muad says, as a foreign observer, it seems to me that the U.S. public is unaware of U.S. foreign policy. And they're themselves so divided between left and right, they seem to live in different realities. Do you have any thoughts on this? I think that yes, there's a lot of people in the U.S. who are divided between left and right. But I think it's important to focus that the people who really, really strongly give a shit about, left and right narratives in the United States probably amounts to like 10, 15% of the population. The vast majority of Americans are too busy, dealing with their own problems to even know who their representatives are, it is not, this is not a country of, as it may look on the news, of like, incredible heightening divisions and near civil war. It's a bunch of folks, 10% of the population who really, really care about this sort of thing. So I guess only Americans can do super chats anymore. That's pretty fucked up. It's a pity. It's a real pity. But hey, that's fucking. These platforms are doing their best to silo themselves and make them less and less useful. Let's see. Narasima asks your thoughts on the U.S. 7th Fleet doing freedom of navigation exercises in India's economic zone exclusive economic zone without India's permission a few days ago. Are there going to be any consequences? I'd be surprised if there are any consequences, honestly. Seems unlikely, sadly. I don't know, sadly. I mean, yeah, I haven't read reports of that, but I don't think that India is likely to pick a fight with the US over that, so, which sounds like it would be something that would have been inadvertent anyway. Um, Sorry if this is a bit ignorant and neither here nor there, but what and where did you study? I studied history and political science at the University of Michigan, graduating 2002. I finished my law degree at the George Washington University in 2011. Yeah, I'd say most of the relevant education for the stuff I do on this channel is just reading. I just read a lot of news. I read a lot of books. And also, I lived in Istanbul, Turkey, for 5 or 6 years, and sort of watched as a whole bunch of U.S. and U.K. Well-paid nationals worked really hard to destroy Syria, and successfully. So yeah, so that's my relevant experience and whatnot. Do you think the democratic system of U.S. is flawed and would be better off with an alternative? No, actually, I think the U.S. Constitution is fucking great. I think that I wish that more people were aware of the power that we have within this system. But I think I think we've got most of the solutions we need within our already existing system, and there are a few amendments that might be worthwhile. I have been convinced by, I was always, oh, come on, the Electoral College is fine. But no, after Trump, winning, being the president despite losing the vote by, 3 to 6 million, and then almost winning again, having lost the vote by like 8 million. Yeah, no, I think the Electoral College is something we should get rid of. I think that the U.S. Congress needs a lot more money and a lot more staff. There's definitely changes I'd make, but I'd say on balance, yeah, I think we're pretty good with the system we got. Questions. Well, I think we're at about 150, so I think I'll start. What's the word? Spieling. Yeah, God, I guess no one can do super chats anymore. That's very sad. Anyway. I got another one. Thank you, Abdigani Sugal. What do you think about Turkey's plans for a spaceport in southern Somalia? Well, that sounds fucking awesome, is what I think about that. Holy cow. Yeah, that sounds great, man. That's what I think about that. Yeah, I'd never heard of that. That sounds like a really cool plan. I think that Turkey probably doesn't have the money it needs to do. Doesn't currently have the. Wow. Okay. So that's interesting. So we can do super chats from some places, but we can't from others. Interesting. How can we not do super chats from Europe because of some kind of like what's the special legislation or something? How irritating. So super chat, Turkey's plans for a spaceport in southern Somalia. I think that sounds really cool. I don't know that. I mean, are there Turkish companies with the capacity to reach orbit at this point? And does Turkey have the discretionary funds at this point to do that sort of thing? I would have a lot of further questions about that. Yeah, GDPR. Yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe Europeans can't do it anymore. Can't do super chats anymore. That'd be super chats from work. Okay, so maybe it's just the EU. Thoughts on El Salvador's presidente? I'm sorry, Daniel Casada. I do not know who El Salvador's. Oh, the Palestinian guy, right? Bukele. I can't pronounce that. Forgive me. Yeah, it's fascinating. I was reading about El Salvador a little bit, and so the president is, I think, distinguished himself by walking into the parliament fully armed. That's never cool. That's a real problem. But then his party won. So I think El Salvador is obviously a country with a lot of problems. Civil war that the U.S. helped spark and maintain during the Cold War era had been run not particularly well, I understand, by two parties, one of which represented the guerrillas and one of which represented the folks who were fighting the guerrillas for, I think, since the Cold War. And I think this Bukele is I'm sure I'm massacring his name, is an antidote to that. You know, he's of neither party. I think he started out in one of the parties, but then abandoned it to do his own thing. And you know, he promises to be new and different and better. And you know, occasionally when a politician promises that, it's true. But yeah, he's definitely got some. I'm aware that he's got some troubling authoritarian instincts. Somebody's going to go fully armed in the parliament is never a good thing. But you know, I wish him the best. It's a difficult country to run, and has been run very poorly for a very long time. So you can't speak. Sorry, I mean that's all I really know about the El Salvador's current president. I apologize. Okay. So I think, yeah, we're coming around 2 hours. I'm sorry to see that this is, we have super chat problems. But anyway, my name is Rob Morris. I do videos every Tuesday. Usually they're more produced than this. I do 2 live chats every month. I do one that is public. That is what we are experiencing now. And I do one that is for patrons only. You can sign up for the patrons newscast and in the description below. It is what's the word? It's a lot of fun, the patrons newscast, because I mean, everybody, you know, obviously folks want me to talk about a ton of stuff. In the newscast, I try to talk about everything the patrons want me to talk about, which means that I do which means that I go through this. Basically, I assemble the topics from the patrons, and then I go through the list of 10, 15 stuff. I do research the morning before so I can say something about all of them. It's more of a conversation. Only about 5, 10 people show up to that. And you can have access to that if you sign up to support me on Patreon, which I'd be very grateful for. Yeah, so Rob Morris, you can find me on Twitter at RoboLaw. RoboLaw, that's Twitter, where the conversation continues. I spend too much time on Twitter, as do many people on this chat. You can find me on Instagram at The Golden Age. Yes, that's the social media stuff. I should do more social media stuff. You can buy books that I've written called Fatka and the New Birth of American Empire. It's very technical and complex, but it's actually pretty important. I talk a fair amount about how the U.S.'s real power isn't the military, isn't the military bases, isn't the defense spending. It's actually legal and financial. And this gets into the technical details of one of those examples. This is Everybody's Lying About Islam, which is about the U.S.-Saudi Arabian relationship and how it's at the heart of a lot of the war on terror that the U.S. was so involved with. That's a little bit of a thicker book and probably a more fun read than the Fatka read. Then we have Avoiding the British Empire, which is sort of my big book that explains everything. Basically sort of a stealth history of the past 250 years, or at least the first half of the past 250 years, talking about sort of the modern world, how it got this way, how the British Empire sort of served to make that, and how British Empire's screw-ups basically destroyed the world that it had made in 2 world wars, leaving the United States to pick up the pieces. And I want to avoid the British Empire because it seems to me now that the U.S. is making a lot of the same mistakes. This is a nice long book that is fun to read, and I think explains much of my worldview and much of why the world looks this way today. Bye. So yes, those are the books. You can follow me on Twitter. You can follow me on the Instagram. I would love it if more people signed up on Patreon, especially as it seems like Europeans can't do super chats anymore, which makes me sad. You can also send me money on PayPal. That's a thing that happens. And please like, subscribe, comment on the videos. I think folks have noticed I just have not been growing. The channel has not been growing recently. And some of that has to do with other changes that Google has made that make things difficult. Yeah, I mean, it's like we're back at the beginning. We're back in 2014, where the best way to grow the channel is one by one. You know, if you enjoyed this and you have friends who you think may have enjoyed this, please send it to them. I would like this thing to keep growing. Anyway, I'm so grateful to all of you who are here and being here. Rami Ilkic, sorry to say these are Chilean pesos, not dollars. Like, wow, 10,000. That's a huge super chat. Just wanted to check super chats work from Chile, which they do. Thank you. Thank you, Rami. And yeah, thanks to all of you. The More Freedom Foundation, such as it is, would not exist without all of you out there keeping this thing going. And I'm very grateful. And I think that is that. Strategic Study says you are not taking many questions. Sorry. Libya forming a new coalition government. Is there anything Saudi Arabia can do now to stop a democratic Libya? Oh, yes, there is. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there are many opportunities for them to derail Libya, which would, I think, make it, but they won't, just as they wouldn't have destroyed Syria if the US makes it clear that it is invested in the Libyan thing succeeding. All we have to do is tell them not to destroy. All the US government has to do, all the Biden administration has to do, is simply tell the UAE and Saudi Arabia not to destroy Libya. And maybe they already have. Maybe that's why the Libya thing has gotten as far as it has. It's gotten farther than I expected. If the UAE and Saudi Arabia had gone to the House of Representatives government and Haftar and said, you know, fuck it, don't do anything that they want, just, you know, stop. We're still gonna back you to be the future rulers of Libya, then I don't know if it would have happened. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a situation with militias and multiple layers of power. There are many places where the UAE or Saudi Arabia could insert itself and blow everything up. That has not yet happened. So actually, that's an indicator that perhaps Saudi Arabia and UAE have been sort of forced not to, or simply told not to, because a peaceable Libya has now become a priority. Possible. That nerd asks, do you like Iraqi food? I have never had Iraqi food. If it's anything like Syrian food, I like it. Okay, I think that, yeah, we are 2 hours and 2 minutes in. And I think it is time to go. Thank you all for being here. You're all the best, and very grateful.